Welcome to Fins, Fur, and Feathers, the Fish and Wildlife Management podcast at K-State Research and Extension. I'm Dr. Drew Ricketts.
And I'm Dr. Joe Gergen. We're both lifelong hunters and anglers, and K-State Research and Extension specialists who help citizens with their fish, wildlife, and pond management needs. If you've ever had a wildlife or pond management challenge, then this is the podcast for you.
We address common fish and wildlife management problems using a scientific approach to provide proven and practical solutions to the issues that you may be facing.
Well, welcome back to another episode of Fins, Fur, and Feathers, and we're getting big time, Drew. We're on YouTube now. We're starting to get some views there, so fun for people to be able to see my pretty face. I mean, they have to suffer through you, I'm sure, but it's just another avenue that we're sharing the podcast. You know, it's obviously on Spotify and lots of other places where you can go download it, but it's kind of fun to have that video too. So I just want to encourage some of our listeners to go check out YouTube if you want to see us laugh and discuss things together. So today I think we're going to focus on a critter that, you know, it kind of seems mysterious, but you say they're fairly common. We're going to talk about armadillos today. So you know, I am familiar with armadillos from when I lived kind of down in Arkansas and more so here recently, but growing up in Ohio, you know, I wasn't really familiar with them. So tell us kind of about, you know, what armadillos do we have, and are they common in Kansas?
Sure, yeah. So the armadillos are one of those critters that, you know, if you live sort of from the north end of Kansas south, you probably have been seeing them for a while. If you live north of there, maybe you haven't seen them at all or only see them when you travel. And a lot of times when we're seeing them when we travel, it's just roadkills. There's one species of them in North America, kind of like when we talked about opossums. There's one species of opossum up here. There's one species of armadillo, but there's a whole bunch of different species of armadillos in South America. So it's one of those species that you know, originated down in Southern America, or not Southern America, but South America, adapted into a whole bunch of different species, and really since there's been Europeans living in North America, they've been moving north. That's something that I kind of had always associated with changes in how colder winters are and stuff like that was allowing armadillos to move north out of Mexico. But really, if we look at the records, the first ones sort of got into Texas sometime before 1850, which wasn't that long ago. And then they started spreading across Texas and into Louisiana by about, you know, the early 1900s, across Oklahoma during that same time frame. And one of the interesting things that's happened recently is there was some genetic work and morphological work on looking at skulls of armadillos in museums, and they figured out that the 9-banded armadillo, which is what we thought we had here, is actually 4 different species. And the one that's in Mexico and on up into North America, they're now calling the Mexican long-nosed armadillo. So I'm just going to call them armadillos. But all of that to say, basically, that we're acknowledging there's a whole bunch of different species of them. But for the rest of the episode, we're going to talk about the Mexican long-nosed armadillo.
I like the naming of these. They're just, you know, how many bands do they have, or what does their nose look like? So that's kind of good description, good descriptive behavior. But you know, they reclassified them. You said that was largely because of genetics. Is there anything else going into that?
Not from what I can gather. I mean, it's, you know, in a lot of mammals, we determine the difference between different species based on how many different kinds of teeth they have, or how bones are shaped in their skull and different things like that, if it's not an obvious difference. And there are some minor differences in the morphology of the skull between these different species, but really the genetic data, I think, is what they keyed in on. And even the paper that talks about them being distinct species says that you're not going to be able to tell in the field. If you had all 4 of them sitting there, you wouldn't be able to tell which is which.
Yeah, they all look similar.
Yeah.
So this one species has decided to move north for some reason, right? And do you know why they're moving north? Are they still moving north? Have they kind of hit the extent of the range? What's their movement patterns look like?
Well, it seems like this species is going to continue to expand until it reaches that whatever the northern limit that it's able to get through winters at, which is what I kind of hinted around. That's sort of the main thing that people have thought was limiting their distribution for some time, is that they just can't handle cold all that well, and it's not just them being able to handle cold, but also they mainly eat insects. So a critter that mainly eats insects might have a hard time finding food and sustaining itself during the wintertime. So that's probably another part of it. But for now, they're continuing this northward range expansion that's been going on basically as long as or since before European colonization in North America, probably.
Yeah. It's always, for me, it's kind of fun to see an armadillo because they just look so crazy. They have that shell on there. I assume that's a hard, bony type structure to protect them. Is that correct? Just thinking about their looks, they kind of look like they have a turtle shell is what I'd describe it as.
They do look like that, and it's interesting. Some of the names from the native people in South America describe them that way. They called them turtle rabbits, or at least that's what the translation would be.
That's a good name for them, I think.
Yeah. But the thing is, it's not as much of a shell as we might think it is. If we think about like a turtle shell, there's some bone associated with that. It provides a whole lot of protection, and that armor that an armadillo has is there to provide protection, but they're actually dermal plates, so it's basically really thick, leathery skin, and it's it's something that, of course, a bullet would penetrate, or if you ran over one with a car, that thick, leathery skin might protect them from, let's say, a coyote grabbing a hold of them from the outside, but it's not going to protect them from a car or a bullet or something like that.
They can they roll up into a ball? Is that something they can do too?
It is, but the ones that we have in North America, the species that we have, can't make that perfectly round ball and totally roll up. It's I believe it's a 7-banded armadillo down in South America that can do that. I actually got to see one of those when I was in Paraguay. We were out driving around and had one in the spotlight or the car headlights, and one of the guys that I was with ran out and caught it, and it just, he was palming it like a basketball, so it was pretty cool, I thought.
That is neat. Definitely rolled up, protected itself, thought it was scary. So, but that's cool to think about them. So around here, they might not be a perfect ball, but those plates are still, they're kind of serving a shell-type purpose. Maybe don't call them a shell, but still kind of a similar type of purpose of protecting the animal. Right?
It is, yeah. And the other thing, too, is those dermal plates overlap. And so no matter how the animal moves, they're still covering that upper surface of their back. And so they almost overlap kind of the same way that a roly-poly shell would or something like that.
Yeah. They're very characteristic. You see an armadillo, it's an armadillo. Other than those plates, I'm guessing the long nose, given their name, what are some other characteristics that they might have that just interesting morphology?
Sure. So the skin is really scaly. They don't have a lot of hair on their upper parts. They have more hair down below, closer to the ground. But the species that we have in North America doesn't have a whole lot of hair on the outside of its body. So that's kind of an interesting thing. They do have that long tail, of course. From a reproductive standpoint, they're interesting in that a female has one egg that's fertilized when they mate, and then that one egg splits into 4 identical quadruplets.
Wow.
Splits into 4 embryos that develop into 4 identical quadruplets.
Every time?
Yeah, every time. They don't always survive every time, but that's what they do when they reproduce, and that's a neat thing that we don't always see.
That is neat. I'm glad that doesn't happen in humans. 'Cause one kid at a time isn't enough for me.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. They're and they're generally found close to the ground. Do they live in holes? Do they live in trees? Where are they living at most of the time?
Yeah, they're not really good climbers. They have adaptations to be really good diggers. One of those is they've got really large claws for digging. They also got pretty small eyes. They don't see very well, so if you're quiet, you can sneak up on an armadillo and scare it if you want to.
And when you scare them, they tend to, maybe this is made up too, but they kind of jump up in the air and get startled.
Yeah, when an armadillo gets startled, they jump. Not every time, but a lot of the time they'll jump, and they'll jump high enough that sometimes if you try to straddle one with a car, rather than hitting it with the tire, or you sure don't want to swerve to avoid something, right? Because that can cause a wreck. But generally, with a lot of critters, if we straddle them, then that's a safer thing to do for our car, and you might save the critter. Well, an armadillo, sometimes when they get startled by that, they'll jump straight up.
Right into
yeah,
it.
yeah, and they might damage. If they jump early enough, they might damage your grill. If they jump later, then they might damage something underneath your car.
Maybe that has something to do with why we see so many of them out on the road. So.
It could. So. It could also have something to do with their poor eyesight, too.
Yeah, they don't know we're coming. So said they had these long claws. I interrupted you when you were talking about that, but they're using them to dig. Are they digging holes to live in? Are they finding food? What are they doing with those?
All the above. So they dig burrows that they stay in, and generally speaking, if we're thinking about identifying the burrows that animals create, the burrow is going to be shaped kind of like the critter.
Yeah.
So if we're thinking about a badger or something like that, we tend to see sort of an oblong-shaped hole that might be 10 inches across and 6 or 8 inches tall. Armadillo burrows tend to be pretty round, and they're usually going to be 6 or 8 inches across. So bigger than a grapefruit, but not as big as a volleyball.
Sure,
probably.
I'm surprised that's big enough for an armadillo to get into. Maybe they seem like they're a lot bigger than that when I'm driving by them on I-70. So,
well, if you think about an armadillo head, 1.5 inches across, probably at most, is going to be the diameter of that head. So they're smaller than they look.
Sure, and you said they're digging for food too. So what are they eating there?
They eat a lot of insects and other invertebrates. So beetles that live in the ground, wasps, ants, all those sorts of things that live in the ground. Of course, the larvae of beetles, the larvae of cicadas, all those kinds of insects that are going to be down there, and then other invertebrates too. So, things like earthworms and millipedes, centipedes, that kind of stuff that's down there.
Yeah, so that might be a great thing out in some CRP or something, or out in the wild. But if I'm an agriculture producer listening to this right now, I probably am not a big fan of armadillos, I would guess, if they're out there digging up bugs all the time looking for food. So I imagine they can cause damage. Is that something that you see or that we should be worried about?
Yeah, it absolutely is. And that's one of the things about this critter that, we haven't had abundant populations of armadillos in Kansas very long, and so people are still getting used to this, still getting used to identifying the damage, thinking about what critter might be responsible for it and all that kind of stuff and what's going on. Most of the time, armadillo digging out in an agricultural setting it's superficial. It may be unsightly. It might give somebody a little bit of heartburn to see it. But they don't cause a lot of damage to crops. They don't do enough digging most of the time that it's going to take away from forage for cattle or other livestock. Usually, the depressions that they make, so that the average armadillo digging that you're going to see is not a burrow. It's going to be more of a little spot where they've been scraping or digging after the prey that they're after. And, those can be anywhere from an inch wide and a half inch deep to a 6-inch wide depression that might be 2 or 3 inches deep. And when there's a whole bunch of those 6-inch wide depressions that are 2 or 3 inches deep in one spot, that's what gets people's attention a lot of times. But most of the time, it's not a problem out in an agricultural setting. But when they are in a yard, when they get into a flower bed, when they're out in a park, And in those sorts of settings where we've got turf grass that we care about, we've got expensive landscaping that we care about, then they can cause a lot of damage in those sorts of settings.
Yeah. So, human-wildlife conflict we talk about quite a bit on this podcast. And so damage to the environment around us, to different habitats, are there any risks to humans or any other health effects maybe we should worry about?
Well, that's one of the interesting things that we always need to think about. And armadillos are sort of unique in that they're one of only 2 species besides humans that can host leprosy. So folks that know about that tend to be pretty concerned about it. The thing to know about leprosy is that it's a bacteria that is transmitted to a host from soil that has that bacteria in it. It can be spread from infected animal to a human. It can be spread from human to human, of course. But you have to have that bacteria in the soil in an area in order for that infection to be present in the area. In the United States, it's pretty rare. Yeah. There's some leprosy, or we would call it Hansen's disease, when it's in humans. But that bacteria is definitely present in some coastal areas in Florida, Louisiana, and Texas. And in those areas, the armadillos can be infected with it. But 95% of humans aren't susceptible to the leprosy bacteria because our immune systems are able to fight it off before that infection ever starts. So most people aren't even at risk. But the main thing to know about leprosy and armadillos is if you don't handle an armadillo, then you don't have to worry about getting leprosy from one. So being aware that that's a potential thing that could happen is I'd say the most important thing for people to understand.
Yeah, that's probably just good advice in general. Don't handle wildlife unless you're a professional or you know what you're doing. Right?
Absolutely. The other interesting thing about that is I mentioned seeing one of those 7-banded armadillos when I was in Paraguay. Before I went on that trip, I talked to another mammologist who had lived down there for a number of years and done a bunch of research, and he was telling me that the main wildlife-based protein that folks eat down there in Paraguay where I was going was armadillo. So I immediately thought, well, what about leprosy? How do you make sure that you don't get leprosy from an armadillo? And he said, well, if you're going to a meat market and you're going to buy an armadillo, or if somebody's going to feed you some, just look at its ears. And as long as its ears aren't crusty, you'll probably be okay.
Did you try some?
No, I did not. We didn't have the opportunity to eat any armadillos while I was down there.
You'll have to go back to Paraguay.
I might
guess,
have
huh?
to. Yeah.
So if we are thinking about armadillos and they're causing a problem, but it sounds like we don't need to be scared of them for the most part, right? We need to be aware of them and some ideas that they can cause some harm. But what are some things if we start to see them and we don't want them around? What can we do to help keep populations where they should be?
Sure. So the one of the things that I like to quote from Charlie Lee, who was here before us, is this acronym HER that he used a lot to talk about practical wildlife damage management. And the reality is that there's a whole semester's worth of options to deal with wildlife damage, but only a few of those are going to be practical for most species in most situations. And that HER acronym stands for habitat modification, exclusion, and removal. So if we think about options for dealing with armadillo damage that might fall into the habitat modification category, basically we're thinking about cover, food, and water when we're thinking about habitat modification. Armadillos are going to be able to get their water from most of the surrounding areas, so they're probably not going to be super attracted to a goldfish pond or a bird bath or something like that out in your yard. If we think about food, one of the things that is oftentimes recommended falsely to folks for critters that like to eat insects and that sort of thing is that, well, if you treat your yard for grubs, then you'll eliminate the food source and you won't have critters like armadillos or moles or skunks digging out in your yard. And the reality is that you can kill most of the grubs. We have insecticides that are labeled for beetle larvae that are very effective at removing those. But that's just one of the things that's out there that these critters are eating, right? There's all kinds of invertebrates like earthworms out there. Well, there's not a pesticide that is labeled for earthworms in Kansas. You can, if you put enough of some of the other insecticides down that you're violating the label, then you can kill a lot of earthworms. But if you're doing things legally and if you're being at all conscious of your impact on everything else, then you're not going to kill all of the invertebrates that are in your yard. So that's not typically a good option.
The other thing there too is if you do kill everything, if you were able to, you're probably going to cause more damage than some of these critters would cause anyway.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
So that's there's multiple reasons to not go out and just spill tons and tons of pesticide out on your lawn.
For sure. Use them according to the label because they're a good tool. But when we get outside that label, then we're at risk of things.
Yep.
Yeah. So the main option for habitat modification that can be effective for armadillos is limiting things like brush piles that might provide them a place to dig a burrow and be safe. Similar to that would be, and I'm probably going to sound like a broken record as we talk about a bunch of these different species, but open sheds with open foundations or sheds that are up on skids. That provides good cover for these sorts of critters to dig underneath to create their burrows. So just, lining that area that would be open with some pavers or some big cement blocks and that sort of thing can be very effective there. So if we think about excluding armadillos, you're probably not going to be 100% effective with exclusion because they're such good diggers that they can dig under fences. The caveat to that is you're making it inconvenient for them to come into your yard, right? They would typically hit that fence, work their way along the fence, and keep on going, unless they can smell something in your yard that makes them think they want to be in there, and then they might dig. So if we've got a good tight fence, it could be a chain link fence, it could be the privacy type, overlapping wooden slat fence. As long as they're really tight to the ground and as long as it's a tight fence that's not loose that they'd easily be able to push under, you're going to exclude most of the armadillos from your yard. Just understand that they might be able to squeeze under a gap that's a lot smaller than you would think that they could. And if there's something in there that they really, really want, they might dig under. Removal is, of course, the option that pops into most people's heads the most often. You've got a critter bothering you, you just want to get rid of it, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. So it's definitely a good short-term solution, but those other solutions might be better long-term solutions to prevent future problems from happening. Removing armadillos can be a challenge. There's no registered pesticide products for armadillos, so if you did try and poison them with something, then that's going to be illegal. And that's because you're exposing other things that we don't want to kill. You might be exposing people and all those sorts of things. Shooting is definitely an option if you are out in the country and you don't have to worry about restrictions on discharging firearms and that sort of thing. Armadillos are primarily nocturnal, but they are active during the daytime sometimes, especially around dusk and dawn. And then the colder it is, the more likely they are going to be active during the wintertime too.
Is it the type of thing where you're going to see one armadillo and you shoot it and it's, the problem's gone, or are there going to be big groups of them moving around?
Sure. It depends on where you're at. So we don't usually see herds of armadillos, thank goodness. But if you're in an area that's got a pretty dense population of armadillos, then you might have half a dozen of them that are using your yard.
Yep.
But they're probably not going to be running around together. So, if you remove one, that doesn't necessarily mean you've taken care of your problem.
Sure.
There are some folks who, in order to overcome the fact that they're nocturnal and they might not see that critter out there at night, have basically connected sort of like an alarm in the house to a motion-activated sensor outside so that when there's an armadillo out digging in the flower bed or out digging in the yard, then they get woke up and they can grab that firearm and they can run outside and take care of the problem, kind of like Rambo.
You got to really not like armadillos to have a MacGyver up a Rambo type attack on them. So
well, the thing about that, though, is, you know, in the areas where armadillos have become really abundant, there are a lot of them.
Yeah.
And they can do a lot of damage. And if you want to have a well-manicured yard, they can do a lot of damage really quickly.
Sure.
And so this is kind of going backwards a little bit, but one of the things talking about armadillos getting into Kansas and people not being used to them, you know, I grew up down right on the state line with Oklahoma. And during the 80s, when we lived in Independence, we would go to Bartlesville to do our back-to-school shopping. And during the late 80s, I was old enough to remember what was going on. And we'd go to Bartlesville, and I'd get all excited because we'd see roadkill armadillos down in Oklahoma. And, you know, I don't remember how far Bartlesville is into Oklahoma, but it's not more than 30 miles, I don't think. And so we would see them in Oklahoma, but we never saw them dead on the roads in Kansas, even though there were some records of some, even as far north as Salina from the 80s. But there wasn't a large enough population that you saw very many of them. By the time I graduated high school, right before 2000, we were starting to see them pretty often in that tier of counties down there that touches Oklahoma. And by the time I graduated college around 2003, we felt like we were covered up with them. So they went from being pretty rare to being very abundant to being abundant enough that they're causing quite a few problems in a short period of time.
Sure. Seeing one or two is probably fun. Like you said, if they're digging up your flowers or ruining your yard, it probably doesn't take very long for you to want to wake up in the middle of the night and do something about it.
Yeah, for sure. So getting back to removing them, thinking about the other option, which is trapping, it tends to be that either a cage-style trap or a wooden box trap is going to be the most effective way to trap them. The problem is that they're not consistently or reliably attracted to any sorts of bait that we have. You know, they eat insects. It's hard to make an insect-based bait or lure that is effective for a lot of these critters for some reason. Some folks do have a little bit of luck trapping armadillos with rotten fruit in like a cage trap for bait, rotten bananas or rotten cantaloupe. You know, if it's starting to be really pungent smelling, you can smell that sweet smell from a long ways away, then that can be effective. Other people have tried, you know, like earthworms that we've bought for fishing that have gone moldy and slimy and that sort of thing. So you can catch some with baits. To make those cage-style traps or box traps more effective, what we can do is what we call drift fence. And so we're using a natural barrier, like let's say a fence in a yard or a house or the side of a shed, and then off of that, we're putting our trap right up against that natural barrier, and we're using a double door trap so that they can come in from either side. And then we're taking something else. It could be some fencing material. It could be like a 2x10, and we're placing that at an angle into the mouth of the trap, and then going out away from it so that an armadillo is going to hit that object or it's going to hit the house. And like we talked about it hitting a fence and going along the outside of that, they'll follow that right into the trap, and you can catch them that way without having any bait. And if we use a double door trap, we can do that on both sides. You could also use two closely spaced trees in a yard that might be a natural funnel, but we're still going to have to use some drift fence off of that.
Sure.
So that's how to make those cage traps or box traps really effective. The other thing that somebody figured out is that after they had caught an armadillo in a wooden box trap, they caught a whole bunch more. And you can take those wooden box traps the first time or two that you use them, then you're going to still have to use drift fence. But once you catch an armadillo in there, they pee and poop, they roll around in there, and so now that trap smells like an armadillo. And those are actually 8 times more effective than a baited cage trap.
Wow.
If we're not using drift fence at all. And there is one company who you can buy those from that you can buy them unscented or you can buy them pre-scented. So, and I can tell you from experience, when you buy them pre-scented, you're not going to get it right away. Yeah. He's going to go out there and use drift fencing to funnel an armadillo in there, get it good and smelly, and then that's what you're going to get shipped.
You get what you pay for.
That's right. That's right. But they are effective, and that's why he can sell those.
Sure.
For sure.
What are some benefits of armadillos? Why would we want them around?
Well, it's hard to think of a benefit that we have specifically here in Kansas by the fact that armadillos have moved in. You know, their niche was already occupied by a bunch of other species, and they probably do provide some benefit through the insects and other invertebrates that they eat. Really, the main benefit of armadillos that I can see is the fact that they've become basically the only research model for studying leprosy, or Hansen's disease as it's also called, in humans. That bacteria that causes that doesn't grow in artificial media. Mm-hmm. And so armadillos are the model species that in of course a very controlled environment, researchers would infect the armadillos with leprosy and then study how to treat it, study how it affects the mammalian nervous system, study how the immune system responds to it, and all those sorts of things.
Well, Drew, that was a great conversation about armadillos. Definitely learned a lot about, I like that HER analogy, H-E-R, habitat exclusion removal. So that's just good to kind of keep in mind. But fun episode here. We appreciate all of our listeners, as always. Make sure you're leaving us a review wherever you're listening to us. Check out our YouTube channel. We continue to make new videos there. It's KSRE Wildlife on YouTube, so check that out. You'll be able to see episodes of the podcast, and there's also a lot of resources there for managing both aquatic and terrestrial habitats. So make sure you're checking out those different places. Leave us a review, and join us next time. Fins, Fur, and Feathers is hosted by K-State Research and Extension and is part of the Natural Resources University Podcast Network.
The network and this podcast are supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act.